Every single day, she walked into that classroom with her head down. She took the same seat in the back row, right next to the window, where nobody would notice her. And honestly, that was exactly what she wanted. To be invisible, to get through another day without anyone paying attention to her. Her name was Valentina Reyes. She was 14 years old, in the 8th grade, and if you asked any of her classmates to describe her, most of them would struggle to remember anything about her at all. She was just the quiet girl, the one who never raised her hand, the one who wore the same faded blue sweater almost every single day because it was the only one that still fit her properly. But here is the thing about quiet people. Just because they do not speak does not mean they have nothing to say. And Valentina had a whole world inside her that nobody knew about. A world filled with music, with dreams, with a fire that burned so bright it kept her awake most nights. Her story begins in a small apartment on the edge of the city. It was the kind of place where the walls were thin and you could hear your neighbors arguing at midnight. The kind of place where the hot water only worked half the time, and the elevator had been broken for as long as anyone could remember. Valentina lived there with her mother and her 2 younger brothers, Diego and Carlos. Their father had left when Valentina was 9 years old. One day he was there, and the next day he was gone. No explanation. No goodbye, just an empty closet and a mother who had to figure out how to raise 3 kids all by herself. And that is exactly what her mother did. She worked double shifts at a factory on the other side of town. She left before the sun came up and came home after the kids were already supposed to be asleep. Valentina remembered lying in bed, listening for the sound of the front door opening, just so she knew her mother had made it home safe. Because her mother was never around, Valentina became the one who took care of everything. She woke her brothers up for school. She made sure they ate breakfast, even if it was just bread with a little butter. She walked them to the bus stop, helped them with their homework, and put them to bed at night. She was only 14, but in many ways, she had already been a mother for years. School was hard for her. Not because she was not smart. She was actually very intelligent. But she was always tired. She stayed up late every night taking care of things at home, and by the time she got to class, she could barely keep her eyes open. Her grades were not great, and her teachers had already made up their minds about her. Especially one teacher, Mrs. Delgado. Mrs. Delgado taught language arts, and she had a reputation for being tough. Some students respected her for it. Others were terrified of her. She was the kind of teacher who believed she could tell exactly who a student was just by looking at them. And when she looked at Valentina, she saw a girl who did not try. A girl who did not care. A girl who would never amount to anything. She was wrong, but she did not know that yet. What Mrs. Delgado did not know, what nobody at that school knew, was what Valentina did every night after her brothers went to sleep. It started about 2 years ago. Valentina was walking home from school when she passed by a pile of garbage on the side of the street. People in her neighborhood often threw out old furniture and broken appliances, and usually she walked right past without looking. But that day, something caught her eye. It was a keyboard. An old electronic keyboard, the kind that people use to learn piano. It was dusty and scratched, and 3 of the keys were completely missing. Someone had thrown it away like it was worthless. But to Valentina, it was treasure. She picked it up and carried it all the way home. It was heavier than she expected, and by the time she got to her apartment, her arms were aching. But she did not care. She plugged it in, pressed a key, and heard a sound. It actually worked. That night, something changed inside her. She did not know how to play piano. She had never taken a lesson in her life. But she had something that many people do not have. She had hunger. She had a deep, burning desire to learn, and she had the internet. Using her mother's old phone, the one with the cracked screen that could barely hold a charge, she started watching videos online. Free tutorials. Lessons for beginners. She watched them over and over again, pausing and rewinding, trying to make her fingers do what the people in the videos were doing. It was frustrating at first. Her fingers would not move the right way. The sounds she made were ugly and wrong. But she did not give up. Every single night, after her brothers were asleep and the apartment was quiet, she sat down at that broken keyboard and practiced. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into a year. And slowly, something amazing started to happen. She got better. Not just a little better. She got good. Really good. She learned songs she had heard on the radio. She learned classical pieces that she found on the internet. She learned how to read music and how to play by ear. And every time she sat down at that keyboard, she felt something she never felt anywhere else. She felt free. Music became her escape. When she was playing, she was not the poor girl with the absent father and the tired mother. She was not the invisible student in the back row. She was someone else entirely, someone powerful, someone special, someone who mattered, but she never told anyone about it. Not her mother, who was too exhausted to notice. Not her brothers, who were too young to understand. And definitely not anyone at school, because she was afraid. Afraid that if she told people about her dream, they would laugh at her. Afraid that they would tell her she was not good enough. That girls like her did not become musicians. She had heard those kinds of words her whole life. And she did not think she could handle hearing them about the one thing that made her happy. So she kept it secret. Her beautiful, precious secret. And then one day, everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning, and Mrs. Delgado stood at the front of the classroom with a big announcement. She told the class that every student would have to do a presentation. Not just any presentation. They had to talk about something they were passionate about, something that mattered to them, something that showed who they really were. Most of the students were excited. They started whispering about their pets, their sports teams, their hobbies. But Valentina felt her stomach drop. She did not have fancy hobbies. She did not have pets or vacations or expensive activities to talk about. The only thing she had was her music, her secret. For a moment, she thought about lying. She could make something up, talk about something safe and boring. But something inside her said no. Something inside her wanted to share the one thing that made her feel alive. So, when Mrs. Delgado asked each student to write down their topic, Valentina picked up her pencil and wrote one word. Music. She had no idea that this one small decision was about to change her entire life. She had no idea that in just a few days, she would stand in front of that classroom and show everyone who she really was. And she definitely had no idea that the teacher who looked down on her, the teacher who had already decided she was worthless, was about to learn the biggest lesson of her life. But we will get to that. For now, Valentina sat in the back row, clutching that piece of paper with the word music written on it, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt something strange in her chest. She felt hope. The days leading up to the presentation felt like torture for Valentina. Every morning she woke up with a knot in her stomach. Every night she lay in bed wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. She had written that word on the paper. Music. And now, there was no taking it back. She thought about changing her topic. She really did. Maybe she could talk about cooking instead. Or her brothers. Or anything else that would not expose the secret she had been protecting for 2 years. But every time she considered backing out, she remembered how she felt when she played the piano. That feeling of flying. That feeling of being someone. She could not give that up. Not even for safety. So she waited, and worried, and practiced late into the night on her broken keyboard, playing softer than ever so she would not wake her brothers. A week after the assignment was given, Mrs. Delgado decided it was time to check on everyone's progress. She stood at the front of the classroom, with her arms crossed and a look on her face that made most students nervous. She had a way of making you feel small, even when you had done nothing wrong. One by one, she called on students and asked them about their topics. The first girl said she was going to talk about horseback riding. Mrs. Delgado smiled and nodded. The next boy said he was presenting about his father's car collection. Mrs. Delgado seemed impressed. Another student talked about their family vacation to Europe last summer. Mrs. Delgado listened with interest and told him it sounded wonderful. Valentina watched all of this from her seat in the back row. she noticed something that made her heart sink. Every topic that Mrs. Delgado approved of had one thing in common. They all cost money: horseback riding lessons, expensive cars, international vacations. These were things that wealthy families could afford, things that Valentina could only dream about. And then Mrs. Delgado's eyes landed on her. The teacher looked down at her clipboard, scanning the list of names and topics. When she found Valentina's name, she paused. A small smile appeared on her face. Not a kind smile, the kind of smile that comes right before someone says something cruel. Valentina Reyes, Mrs. Delgado said loudly, making sure the whole class could hear. It says here that you want to present about music. Valentina felt 30 pairs of eyes turn toward her. Her face grew hot. She nodded slowly, not trusting her voice. Mrs. Delgado tilted her head to the side like she was studying a puzzle she could not quite figure out. Music, she repeated. That is interesting. Tell me, Valentina. What kind of music? Do you sing? Do you play an instrument? The classroom was completely silent. Valentina could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She knew she had to say something. She could not just sit there like a statue. I play piano, she said quietly. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Mrs. Delgado raised her eyebrows. Piano? Really? She let out a small laugh, like someone had just told her a joke. I did not know that. Do you take lessons somewhere? Which music school do you go to? Some of the students started to snicker. They knew Valentina's situation. Everyone in that school knew which kids had money and which kids did not. And Valentina was very clearly in the second group. Valentina shook her head. I do not take lessons. I taught myself. The snickering grew louder. Mrs. Delgado did not stop it. Instead, she let it continue for a moment before holding up her hand for silence. You taught yourself piano, she said slowly, as if she was speaking to a small child who had just said something ridiculous. And how exactly did you do that? Do you even own a piano? Valentina's throat felt tight. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole, but she forced herself to answer. I have a keyboard, she said. I found it, and I learned from videos on the internet. This time, the laughter was not just snickering. It was loud. Several students were openly laughing at her, and a few were whispering to each other with amused looks on their faces. Valentina could feel tears building up behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them that satisfaction. Mrs. Delgado shook her head slowly, still wearing that cruel little smile. So let me understand this. You found a keyboard somewhere, and you watched some videos, and now you think you can stand up in front of this class and talk about music like you are some kind of expert? The words hit Valentina like punches to the stomach, but Mrs. Delgado was not finished. Valentina, I am going to give you some advice, the teacher continued. Real musicians spend years studying. They take expensive lessons. They practice on real instruments, not toys they found in the trash. Maybe you should pick a different topic. Something more realistic, something you actually know about. A boy in the front row laughed so hard he had to cover his mouth. A girl near the window whispered something to her friend, and they both giggled. Valentina sat frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the edge of her desk so hard her knuckles turned white. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to stand up and tell them all that they were wrong, that she had spent 2 years practicing every single night, that she could play songs they had never even heard of. That music was not just a hobby for her. It was everything, but the words would not come. They were stuck somewhere deep inside her, trapped behind the shame and the embarrassment and the fear. Mrs. Delgado moved on to the next student, and the moment passed. But for Valentina, it was not over. It would never be over. Those words echoed in her head for the rest of the day. During lunch, which she spent alone in a corner of the cafeteria, during her afternoon classes, where she could not focus on anything the teachers were saying, during the long walk home, where she replayed the scene over and over again. Something you actually know about. Real instruments, not toys they found in the trash. By the time she got home, she was crying. She made sure her brothers were busy watching television before she locked herself in the small bathroom and let the tears fall freely. She cried until her chest hurt. She cried until there was nothing left. And then she looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were red and puffy. Her face was blotchy. She looked broken. And for a moment, she almost believed what they said about her. That she was nobody. That her dreams were stupid. That she should just give up and accept that girls like her did not get to have big dreams. But then she thought about her keyboard. That old, broken keyboard with the missing keys and the scratched surface. She thought about all those nights she had spent teaching herself to play, one note at a time. She thought about the music that lived inside her, waiting to come out, and something shifted. The sadness did not go away, but it made room for something else. Something stronger, something that felt like fire. She wiped her tears and walked out of the bathroom. Her brothers were still watching television, completely unaware of what had happened. Her mother would not be home for hours. The apartment was quiet. Valentina walked over to the corner of the living room where she kept her keyboard hidden under an old blanket. She pulled it out, plugged it in, and sat down. And then she played. She played harder than she had ever played before. She played with all the anger, and all the pain, and all the frustration that had been building up inside her. She played until her fingers ached, and her arms were tired, and sweat was dripping down her forehead. She played a piece she had been working on for months. A classical piece by a composer named Chopin. It was one of the hardest pieces she had ever attempted. There were moments in it that still tripped her up, sections where her fingers did not move fast enough. But tonight, she did not care about mistakes. She just played. When she finally stopped, the apartment was dark. Her brothers had fallen asleep on the couch. Hours had passed without her even realizing it. She sat there in the silence, breathing hard, looking down at her hands. These hands that Mrs. Delgado thought were worthless. These hands that had taught themselves to make music out of nothing. And in that moment, Valentina made a decision. She was not going to change her topic. She was not going to hide anymore. She was going to walk into that classroom on presentation day, and she was going to show every single person who had laughed at her exactly who she was. They wanted to see what she could do? Fine. She would show them. Presentation day came faster than Valentina expected. One moment she was making her decision to fight back, and the next moment she was waking up on that Tuesday morning with her heart already racing before her feet even touched the floor. She lay in bed for a few extra minutes, staring at the ceiling. The sun was just starting to peek through the thin curtains of her bedroom window. In a few hours, she would be standing in front of her entire class. In a few hours, everyone would know her secret. The thought made her want to pull the blanket over her head and never come out. But she did not do that. Instead, she took a deep breath, pushed the blanket aside, and got up. She had made a promise to herself, and she was going to keep it. No matter how scared she was, getting her brothers ready for school that morning felt harder than usual. Diego could not find his shoes. Carlos spilled juice all over his shirt and needed to change. By the time Valentina finally got them out the door and onto the bus, she was already exhausted, and the hardest part of the day had not even started yet. She walked back into the apartment and stood in front of her keyboard. It looked even more beaten up than usual in the morning light. The tape holding it together was starting to peel. The missing keys left ugly gaps in the row. The whole thing looked like it belonged in a garbage pile, not on a stage, because that is exactly where it came from. For a moment, doubt crept back into her mind. What was she thinking? She was going to carry this broken piece of junk into a classroom full of kids who already thought she was a joke. She was going to stand in front of Mrs. Delgado, the woman who had humiliated her in front of everyone, and try to prove something with this? Maybe they were right. Maybe she was being ridiculous. But then she pressed one of the keys. Just one. And a note rang out, clear and pure, filling the quiet apartment. And she remembered why she was doing this. She carefully unplugged the keyboard and wrapped it in a plastic bag to protect it. It was not much, but it was all she had. She put it in her backpack, but it did not fit properly. Half of it stuck out the top, and the whole bag looked lumpy and strange. She knew people would stare at her on the bus. She knew they would whisper and point. She did not care anymore. The bus ride to school felt like it lasted forever. A couple of kids from her neighborhood gave her weird looks when they saw the keyboard sticking out of her bag. One of them asked what it was, and she just said it was for a school project. They lost interest after that. When she finally arrived at school, the hallways were buzzing with energy. Presentation day was a big deal. Students were carrying poster boards and laptops, and all kinds of props for their projects. One girl had brought a display case full of trophies from her gymnastics competitions. A boy was wheeling in a model rocket that was almost as tall as he was. And then there was Valentina, walking through the crowd with a taped-up keyboard in a plastic bag. She kept her head down and made her way to Mrs. Delgado's classroom. When she walked through the door, she saw that most of the seats were already filled. Students were chatting nervously, some of them practicing their presentations under their breath. The energy in the room was tense, like everyone was holding their breath. Valentina took her usual seat in the back row. She slid the keyboard under her desk, trying to keep it hidden for as long as possible. But the girl sitting next to her noticed. "What is that?" the girl asked, leaning over to get a better look. "Nothing," Valentina said quickly. "Just something for my presentation." The girl shrugged and went back to looking at her phone, but Valentina could feel her heart pounding. It was really happening. There was no turning back now. A few minutes later, Mrs. Delgado walked into the room. She was carrying a clipboard and wearing the same stern expression she always wore. She stood at the front of the class and clapped her hands twice to get everyone's attention. "All right, settle down," she said. "Today is presentation day. You have all had plenty of time to prepare, so I expect everyone to be ready. We will go in alphabetical order by last name. First up, Andrea Castillo." A girl in the front row stood up and walked to the front of the classroom. She had a beautiful poster board with pictures of her family's beach house and the sailboat they owned. She talked about how sailing was her passion, how her father had taught her to navigate by the stars, how they spent every summer on the water. Mrs. Delgado listened with a smile on her face. When Andrea finished, the class clapped politely, and Mrs. Delgado told her what a wonderful job she had done. The next student talked about his collection of rare coins. The one after that presented about her violin lessons at a famous music academy in the city. Another boy talked about the coding camp he attended last summer, showing off an app he had built. Every single presentation was polished, professional, expensive, and with every single one, Valentina felt smaller and smaller. She watched these kids talk about their lives, their opportunities, their privileges. They had parents who could afford lessons and camps and vacations. They had resources she could not even imagine. And here she was, sitting in the back row with a broken keyboard wrapped in a plastic bag. What was she thinking? She did not belong here. She did not belong with these people. But it was too late to run. The presentations kept going, one after another, and the alphabet kept moving closer and closer to her name. Finally, after what felt like hours, Mrs. Delgado looked down at her clipboard and paused. Valentina saw a flicker of something cross the teacher's face. Amusement, maybe. Or anticipation. Like she had been waiting for this moment. "Valentina Reyes," Mrs. Delgado called out. "You are up." The room got quiet. A few students turned around to look at her, curiosity on their faces. They remembered what had happened last week. They remembered the laughing, the mocking, the way Mrs. Delgado had dismissed her dream like it was nothing. They were expecting a disaster. Valentina could see it in their eyes. She stood up slowly. Her legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. She reached under her desk and pulled out the plastic bag with her keyboard inside. As she walked toward the front of the room, she heard whispers. She heard giggles. She heard someone mutter something under their breath. She kept walking. When she reached the front of the classroom, she turned to face everyone. 30 pairs of eyes stared back at her. Some were curious. Some were bored. Some were already smirking, ready to laugh. And there was Mrs. Delgado, sitting at her desk with her arms crossed. watching with that same look she always had when she looked at Valentina. That look that said she already knew how this was going to end. Valentina's hands were shaking as she unwrapped the plastic bag. When she pulled out the keyboard, she heard the reactions immediately. Gasps. Laughter. Someone in the back said something about a garage sale. She placed the keyboard on the table at the front of the room. It looked even worse under the bright classroom lights. The tape was clearly visible. The missing keys looked like gaps in a smile. The whole thing looked sad and broken and hopeless, just like everyone expected her to be. Mrs. Delgado let out a small sigh. "All right, Valentina. Whenever you are ready." Her voice dripped with impatience, with doubt, with the certainty that this was going to be a waste of everyone's time. Valentina looked at her keyboard. Then she looked at the class. Then she looked at Mrs. Delgado, and something inside her shifted. All the fear, all the doubt, all the shame she had been carrying for so long. It did not disappear, but it moved aside, just enough to make room for something else, something that had been building inside her for 2 years, something that had survived poverty and loneliness and being invisible. She plugged in the keyboard. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. The class held its breath. Mrs. Delgado raised an eyebrow. Then a small light blinked on. The keyboard hummed to life. Valentina sat down on the chair, positioned her fingers over the keys, and closed her eyes. The room was completely silent, and then she began to play. The first note floated through the air like a whisper. Soft, gentle, almost fragile. It hung in the silence of the classroom for just a moment before the second note followed. Then the third. Then more. Each one flowing into the next, like water in a stream. Valentina kept her eyes closed. She did not want to see their faces. She did not want to see Mrs. Delgado's crossed arms, or the smirks of her classmates. She just wanted to disappear into the music, the way she always did late at night in her tiny apartment. The piece she played was called Nocturne, in E-flat major. It was written by a composer named Chopin, over 150 years ago. It was one of the most beautiful and difficult pieces ever written for piano. Professional musicians, who had trained for decades, still found it challenging. And here was Valentina, a 14-year-old girl who had never taken a single lesson, playing it on a broken keyboard held together with tape. At first, nobody in the classroom moved. They were frozen, unsure of what they were hearing. This was not what they expected. They had expected her to fumble, to make mistakes, to prove that Mrs. Delgado was right about her. They had expected to laugh, but there was nothing to laugh at. The music filled every corner of the room. It wrapped around the students like a warm blanket. It climbed the walls and seeped into the ceiling. It was everywhere, touching everything. Impossible to ignore. The melody started slow and dreamy, like someone remembering a beautiful moment from long ago. Valentina's fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible. Despite the missing keys, despite the worn-out buttons, despite everything wrong with that old keyboard, the music that came out was pure. It was perfect. A girl in the second row leaned forward in her seat without realizing it. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes wide. She had taken piano lessons since she was 5 years old. She had performed in recitals and competitions. She knew exactly how difficult this piece was, and she knew she could not play it this well. The boy who had laughed the loudest when Valentina unwrapped her keyboard was now completely still. His smile was gone. His face had changed into something else. Something that looked almost like shame. Even the students who did not know anything about music could feel it. They could feel the emotion pouring out of every note. There was sadness in the melody. There was longing. There was pain. But there was also something else. Something stronger. There was hope. Valentina played with her whole body. Her shoulders swayed gently with the rhythm. Her head tilted slightly as she moved through the more delicate passages. Her fingers danced across the keys like they had done this 1,000 times before. Because they had. Night after night, alone in her apartment, she had trained these fingers to speak a language that words could never capture. The piece grew more complex. The notes came faster, layering on top of each other, building towards something bigger. Valentina's hands moved in ways that seemed almost impossible. reaching across the keyboard, finding notes that should not have been there on an instrument missing 3 keys. But she had practiced on this exact keyboard for 2 years. She knew every broken part, every weakness, every gap. And she had learned to work around all of them. In the middle of the room, a girl felt tears forming in her eyes. She did not even know why she was crying. She just knew that something about this music was reaching inside her chest and squeezing her heart. She was not the only one. Across the classroom, students who had never paid attention to Valentina before were now unable to look away. They watched her fingers move. They watched her face, peaceful and focused, completely lost in the music. They watched this girl they had dismissed as nobody transform into someone extraordinary right before their eyes. And then there was Mrs. Delgado. She had started the presentation with her arms crossed and her expression bored. She had expected this to be over quickly. She had expected to shake her head and move on to the next student, maybe make a comment about being realistic with our goals. But now her arms had fallen to her sides. Her expression had changed completely. Her lips were parted slightly, and her eyes were fixed on Valentina with an intensity she had never shown before. Because Mrs. Delgado knew music. She had studied it in college. She had dreamed of being a pianist herself once. A long time ago. Before life got in the way, before someone told her she was not good enough, before she gave up and became a teacher instead. She knew exactly what she was hearing. She knew how many years of practice it took to play like this. She knew how much talent, how much dedication, how much love for the instrument was required. And she knew she had been completely, terribly wrong about this girl. The music reached its peak. The notes swelled and crashed like waves against a shore. Valentina's fingers flew across the keyboard, hitting every note with precision and passion. The classroom seemed to hold its breath, caught up in the storm of sound. And then, slowly, the music began to calm. The waves settled. The storm passed. The notes grew softer, gentler, more tender, like a lullaby, like a goodbye, like a promise. The final note rang out, pure and clear, and then faded into silence. Valentina kept her eyes closed for a moment longer. Her hands rested on the keys, trembling slightly. She was afraid to open her eyes, afraid to see their faces, afraid that nothing had changed, that they were still laughing at her, that the music had not been enough. But then she heard something, a single clap. She opened her eyes and saw a boy in the front row, the same boy who had laughed at her before, bringing his hands together slowly. His face was serious, respectful. Then another student started clapping. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire classroom was applauding. The sound filled the room, bouncing off the walls, growing louder and louder. Students were rising from their seats. One by one, they stood up, still clapping, some of them wiping tears from their eyes. It was a standing ovation. Valentina sat frozen at the keyboard, unable to process what was happening. This was not real. This could not be real. These were the same people who had laughed at her. The same people who had whispered about her torn clothes and her free lunches. The same people who had looked right through her for years, like she did not exist. And now they were standing. For her. A girl in the third row shouted something. It sounded like, amazing. A boy near the window was shaking his head slowly, a look of disbelief on his face. The girl who had asked about the keyboard earlier was crying openly, not even trying to hide it. The applause went on and on. It seemed like it would never stop. And then Valentina's eyes found Mrs. Delgado. The teacher was still sitting at her desk. She was not clapping. She was not moving at all. She was just staring at Valentina with an expression that was impossible to read. And then Valentina saw something she never expected to see. A tear rolled down Mrs. Delgado's cheek. Just one. A single tear, catching the light as it traced a path down her face. The teacher did not wipe it away. She did not look embarrassed or try to hide it. She just sat there, looking at this girl she had dismissed, this girl she had mocked, this girl she had been so sure would never amount to anything. And in that moment, something broke inside Mrs. Delgado. Something that had been hard and closed off for a very long time. The applause finally began to fade. Students returned to their seats, still buzzing with energy, still looking at Valentina like they were seeing her for the first time. Because in a way, they were. Valentina slowly stood up from the keyboard. Her legs were shaky. Her hands were still trembling. She did not know what to say. She did not know what to do, so she just stood there, this quiet girl from the back row, and let them see her, really see her. For the first time in her life, Valentina Reyes was not invisible, and it was the most terrifying and wonderful feeling she had ever known. She picked up her keyboard, still wrapped in its plastic bag, and walked back to her seat. The students she passed looked at her differently now. With respect. With admiration. With something that looked almost like awe. When she sat down, her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She stared straight ahead, trying to process everything that had just happened. Behind her, she heard someone whisper, "That was incredible." And for the first time in a very long time, Valentina believed it. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Valentina walked through the hallways like she was floating. Still unable to fully understand what had happened in that classroom, students she had never spoken to before smiled at her. A few even stopped her to say how amazing her performance was. One girl asked if she could teach her how to play. It was like waking up in someone else's life. But there was one moment that Valentina kept replaying in her mind. That single tear rolling down Mrs. Delgado's cheek. The way the teacher had looked at her. Like she was seeing a ghost. Like something inside her had cracked open. When the final bell rang, Valentina gathered her things and headed for the door. She was almost out of the building when she heard her name. "Valentina, wait." She turned around and saw Mrs. Delgado standing in the hallway. The teacher looked different somehow. Smaller. The sharpness in her eyes was gone, replaced by something softer. Something almost fragile. "Can you come to my classroom for a minute?" Mrs. Delgado asked. "I would like to talk to you." Valentina's first instinct was to say no. She had spent so long avoiding this woman, trying to stay invisible, trying not to give her any more reasons to criticize her. But something in the teacher's voice made her stop. It did not sound like the Mrs. Delgado she knew. It sounded almost like a request, almost like a plea, so she nodded and followed her back to the empty classroom. Mrs. Delgado closed the door behind them and walked to her desk. But she did not sit in her usual chair. Instead, she leaned against the edge of the desk, facing Valentina, like she did not want anything between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. Valentina stood near the door, clutching the straps of her backpack, waiting. Finally, Mrs. Delgado let out a long breath. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. Almost a whisper. "I owe you an apology." Valentina blinked. Of all the things she had expected the teacher to say, this was not one of them. "What you did today," Mrs. Delgado continued, "was extraordinary. Truly extraordinary. And I almost ruined it. I almost made you give up before you even had a chance to show everyone what you could do." She paused and looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly. "I judged you, Valentina. From the very first day you walked into my classroom, I looked at you, and I decided who you were. I saw a quiet girl with old clothes and tired eyes, and I assumed you were lazy, that you did not care, that you had nothing special to offer." Her voice cracked on the last word. She took a moment to steady herself before continuing. "I was so wrong, and I am so sorry." Valentina did not know what to say. She had imagined this moment so many times. She had imagined Mrs. Delgado admitting she was wrong, apologizing for all the cruel comments and dismissive looks. But now that it was actually happening, she felt something she did not expect. She felt sorry for her. Because looking at Mrs. Delgado now, Valentina did not see a mean teacher. She saw a tired woman carrying something heavy. Something she had been carrying for a very long time. "Can I tell you something?" Mrs. Delgado asked. "Something I have never told any of my students?" Valentina nodded slowly. Mrs. Delgado looked toward the window, her eyes distant. "When I was your age, I wanted to be a pianist. More than anything in the world. I practiced every day. I dreamed about performing on big stages, playing for hundreds of people. I thought music was going to be my whole life. She paused, and a sad smile crossed her face. But my family did not have money. We could not afford a good piano or expensive lessons. And when I auditioned for a music scholarship, the judges told me I was not good enough. They said I did not have proper training. They said I should find a more realistic dream. Valentina felt her heart tighten. She knew exactly how that felt. So, I gave up. Mrs. Delgado said. I stopped playing. I told myself they were right. That I was foolish to think I could ever be a real musician. I became a teacher instead, and somewhere along the way, I became the kind of person who crushes other people's dreams the same way mine were crushed. She turned back to face Valentina, and there were tears in her eyes again. When I saw you today, playing that piece on that broken keyboard, I saw myself. I saw the girl I used to be. The one who loved music more than anything. And I realized something terrible. I had become the person who almost destroyed that girl. I had become the judges who told me I was not good enough. She stepped forward and took Valentina's hands in hers. Her grip was warm and gentle. You have a gift, Valentina. A real, incredible gift. And I am not going to let anyone take that away from you. Especially not me. Valentina felt tears spilling down her own cheeks now. She did not try to stop them. I want to help you, Mrs. Delgado said. There is an arts academy on the other side of the city. They have a music program with full scholarships for talented students who cannot afford tuition. I know some people there. I want to help you apply. Valentina's breath caught in her throat. A scholarship. A real music school. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, but never dared to believe was possible. You would do that? She whispered. After everything? Mrs. Delgado squeezed her hands. It is the least I can do. You deserve this chance, Valentina. You have earned it. The weeks that followed were like something out of a movie. Mrs. Delgado kept her promise. She helped Valentina fill out the scholarship application, wrote her a glowing recommendation letter, and even drove her to the audition herself. But that was not all. During Valentina's presentation, a classmate in the back of the room had recorded her performance on his phone. He posted it online that night, thinking maybe a few friends would see it. By the next morning, it had been shared over 10,000 times. Within a week, the video had gone viral. Millions of people watched this girl with the broken keyboard play Chopin like a professional. News stations picked up the story. Journalists wanted interviews. People from all over the world were moved by this quiet girl who had taught herself piano in a tiny apartment while taking care of her family. And then the donations started coming in. A music store in the city offered to give Valentina a brand new keyboard. A famous pianist saw the video and sent her a personal message of encouragement. A crowdfunding page that someone set up to help her family raised enough money for a real piano, one with all its keys, one that did not need tape to hold it together. When the piano arrived at their apartment, Valentina's mother cried for an hour straight. Her little brothers jumped around it like it was a spaceship that had landed in their living room, and Valentina just sat on the bench, running her fingers over the smooth, perfect keys. Unable to believe this was her life now. 3 months later, she received a letter from the Arts Academy. She had been accepted, full scholarship. She read the letter 5 times before she believed it was real. Then she ran to find her mother, who was just getting home from her factory shift, and showed her the paper with shaking hands. They held each other and cried together, right there in the kitchen, while Diego and Carlos asked what was happening and why everyone was being so loud. Today, Valentina is studying music at one of the best conservatories in the country. She is learning from teachers who see her potential, surrounded by students who respect her talent, building the future she once thought was impossible. But she has not forgotten where she came from. Every year, she goes back to her old school to speak to students. She brings her original keyboard with her, the broken one wrapped in tape, and she tells them her story. She tells them about the nights she spent practicing alone, about the teacher who mocked her, about the moment she decided to stop hiding and start believing in herself. And she always ends with the same message. People will look at you and decide who you are before you even open your mouth. They will see your clothes, your neighborhood, your family situation, and they will think they know everything about you. They will tell you to be realistic. They will tell you that dreams are for other people, not for kids like you. She pauses and looks out at the young faces watching her. Do not listen to them. Your circumstances do not define your potential. Your past does not determine your future. And no one, no matter how loud they are, gets to tell you what you are capable of. She places her hand on the old keyboard beside her. This broken thing changed my life. Not because it was special, but because I refused to give up on myself, even when everyone else already had. She smiles at them. This girl who was once invisible, now standing in the light. Never let anyone convince you that your dreams are too big for your circumstances, because the only person who gets to decide what you can become is you.